The last hope? The dust had been settling on Millfield County for 3 years running, coating everything in a fine layer of disappointment that seemed to seep into a man's bones. Samuel Sam McCready stood at the edge of his property, hat tilted low against the merciless sun, watching the last of his cattle being loaded onto the trailer. The drought had finally claimed what the banks couldn't touch, his hope. 43 years he'd worked this land, same as his daddy before him, and his daddy's daddy before that. The McCready Ranch had weathered the Dust Bowl, survived the Great Depression, and pushed through every lean year that Mother Nature saw fit to throw their way. But this was different. This felt like the earth itself had given up. "That's the last of 'em, Mr. McCready," called out Jake Morrison, the livestock hauler. His voice carried the kind of careful respect folks used when they knew they were witnessing the end of something important. "Real sorry it came to this." Sam nodded, not trusting his voice just yet. The check in his shirt pocket felt heavier than the cattle it represented. Enough to pay off the creditors, maybe keep the house, but not enough to start over. Not at 67. As the truck disappeared down the county road, trailing dust in the last remnants of the McCready legacy, Sam walked back toward the farmhouse. The place looked naked without the cattle, like a man without his shadow. The barn stood empty, its doors hanging open like a mouth frozen in a silent scream. His wife Martha was waiting on the porch, her weathered hands folded in her lap. She'd been his partner through all of it, the good years when the grass grew tall and green, and the lean ones when they'd counted every penny twice. Now she sat quiet, watching him with eyes that held 40 years of shared sorrows and joys. "Coffee's still warm," she said simply. They sat together on the porch swing his grandfather had built, drinking coffee that tasted like dust and defeat. The silence stretched between them, comfortable in the way that only comes with decades of marriage. They didn't need words to share their grief. "Reckon we'll have to sell to Jameson," Sam finally said, the words scraping his throat raw. Martha's cup rattled against the saucer. Richard Jameson owned the feed store and half the county beside. He'd been circling the McCready place like a vulture for months, making increasingly generous offers that felt more like insults with each passing week. "Maybe there's another way," she said, though her voice held little conviction. Sam shook his head, looked at it from every angle. "Martha, we're done." That evening, after the paperwork was signed and Jameson had driven away with his satisfied smile, Sam found himself walking the property one last time. The setting sun painted the brown grass in shades of gold, making it almost beautiful again. Almost. He stopped at the old oak tree that marked the center of the ranch. His great-grandfather had planted it when he'd first claimed this land, back when hope came easier and the soil held promises. Now it stood gnarled and tired, its branches reaching toward a sky that had forgotten how to rain. At the base of the tree was a small wooden box, his grandfather's tool chest, buried there when Sam was just a boy. He'd forgotten about it until now, when forgetting seemed easier than remembering. With his bare hands he dug it up, the dry earth crumbling away like old memory. Inside were his grandfather's things, a worn Bible, a photograph of the family, and wrapped in oilcloth, a small leather pouch. Sam had seen it before but never asked what was inside. His grandfather had been a man of few words and many secrets. The pouch contained seeds, dozens of them, each one carefully wrapped in tissue paper with notes written in his grandfather's careful script. Drought corn, 19. Sam almost laughed at the name, but something in his grandfather's handwriting stopped him. The old man had survived the worst drought in living memory, had built this ranch from nothing when the land was harder and the times leaner. Without really deciding to, Sam found himself preparing the small vegetable garden behind the house. Martha watched from the kitchen window as he worked by moonlight, turning the hard-packed earth with his hands, coaxing it back to life one handful at a time. "What are you planting out there?" she called through the screen door. "Hope," he answered, and meant it. The next morning brought no relief from the heat, but Sam watered his small plot with precious well water, each drop a prayer sent into the ground. The neighbors who stopped by looked at him with concern. "Old Sam McCready," they whispered, finally lost his mind along with his cattle. By the third day word had spread through town. At Mabel's diner, over coffee and speculation, the story grew with each telling. Some said he was planting money, others that he'd gone completely crazy from the heat. A few of the older folks remembered stories about the McCready family and their strange ways with the land. His grandfather used to talk to his crops, Old Pete Williamson told anyone who'd listen. Said plants knew things people had forgotten. The week crawled by like a wounded animal. Sam watered his small garden each morning and evening, ignoring the looks from passing motorists and the whispered conversations that stopped when he entered the general store. Martha supported him with the fierce loyalty that had kept their marriage strong through 4 decades, but he could see the worry in her eyes. On the 7th day, just after dawn, Martha's scream brought Sam running from the barn. She stood at the edge of the garden, her hand pressed to her mouth, staring at something that shouldn't have been possible. Where Sam had planted his grandfather's seeds, the earth had erupted in a riot of green unlike anything seen in the county for 3 years. But it wasn't just the growth, it was the impossibility of it. Corn stalks stood 8 feet tall, their leaves a green so deep it hurt to look at. Tomato plants heavy with fruit climbed toward the sky, and beans hung in clusters thick as grape. Flowers bloomed in colors that had no names, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with life. Sam, Martha whispered, "What did you plant?" Before he could answer, the sound of car engines filled the morning air. Word traveled fast in a small town, and half of Millfield seemed to be driving up the dirt road to see for themselves. The first to arrive was Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, the county extension agent. She stepped out of her truck with the measured pace of someone trying to maintain professional skepticism in the face of the impossible. Behind her came Pastor Williams, the Jameson family, and what looked like half the congregation from the Methodist Church. "I've never seen anything like it," Dr. Hartwell said, kneeling beside the corn stalks. "The soil conditions, the drought, this should be impossible." The crowd grew larger as the morning wore on. Cars lined the county road, and people stood in hushed groups, pointing and whispering. Some reached out to touch the plants as if they might disappear at any moment. Old Pete Williamson pushed through the crowd, his weathered face split by a grin. "I told you folks," he said loudly, "the McCreadys always had a way with the land. This here's what you call hope made manifest." By noon the story had reached the county seat. By evening television crews from 3 different stations had set up in Sam's front yard. Reporters with perfect hair and city shoes trampled through his miracle garden, asking questions he couldn't answer. "How do you explain this unprecedented growth?" asked a blonde woman with a microphone that looked bigger than some of his vegetables. Sam pushed his hat back and considered the question. "Reckon some things don't need explaining," he said finally. "They just need belief." The story spread beyond the county, beyond the state. Within days, scientists were taking soil samples and botanists were studying the plants with instruments Sam had never seen before. None of them could explain what had happened in his garden, though they used plenty of fancy words. The miracle brought more than curiosity, it brought hope. Farmers from 3 counties over came to see the impossible garden, carrying their own seeds, and their own desperate prayers. Some asked to buy clippings, others just wanted to touch the soil that had remembered how to bloom. Richard Jameson appeared on the 3rd day after the discovery, his earlier smugness replaced by something that might have been awe. "I'd like to withdraw my offer on your land, Sam," he said quietly. "Seems like this place has got more life in it than I thought." Hartwell returned with a team from the state university, armed with theories about soil composition and underground water sources. They tested everything twice, took samples of soil and plant matter, and left shaking their heads. "There's no scientific explanation," she told Sam privately. "The mineral content, the moisture levels, by every measure this soil should be dead, but somehow it's more alive than anything I've ever seen." On Sunday, Pastor Williams devoted his entire sermon to the miracle garden, speaking of faith and the mysterious ways that hope could take root in the hardest ground. The church was fuller than it had been in years, filled with people looking for their own piece of the impossible. But it was Martha who understood the real miracle. She found Sam that evening, sitting by the old oak tree where it all began. "It's not just the plants, is it?" she said, settling beside him on the ground that had become holy. Sam looked out over his impossible garden, then beyond it to the brown fields that stretched to the horizon. "No," he said softly, "it's not." In the week since the garden had bloomed, something had changed in the county. Neighbors were talking to each other again, sharing resources and ideas they'd kept to themselves during the lean years. The local bank had started a fund to help struggling farmers, and 3 families had decided to stay instead of selling out and moving to the city. Hope, it seemed, was as contagious as despair. The scientists never did find their explanation. The soil samples showed nothing unusual, the plants followed no known patterns of growth, and the water that nourished them came from the same drought-stricken well that barely sustained the house. But the garden continued to thrive, becoming a pilgrimage site for people who had forgotten how to believe in miracles. They came from hundreds of miles away, carrying their own seeds and their own desperate stories, planting them in the shadow of the impossible, and learning to wait with faith instead of fear. Sam never sold the ranch. The miracle garden provided enough produce to feed half the county, and the visitors it attracted brought new life to the dying town. Mabel's diner stayed open late to serve the curious crowds. The gas station hired extra help, and for the first time in years, children played in yards instead of being loaded into moving trucks. Years later, when reporters still occasionally came to ask about the miracle, Sam would take them to the old oak tree and tell them about his grandfather's seeds. Some wanted to dig up more, thinking they could replicate the miracle in their own soil. "Don't work that way," Sam would tell them, his voice gentle but firm. "Miracles ain't something you can package and sell. They're something you plant in faith and tend with love, and sometimes, if you're blessed, they bloom in their own time." The garden still grows today, a testament to the truth that hope buried deep enough in willing soil can bloom beyond all reason or understanding. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind is just right, visitors swear they can hear the whispered conversations between the plants and the old man who tends them, sharing secrets that only the earth and the faithful know. As autumn approached, the miracle garden showed no signs of slowing. While every other crop in the county withered under the relentless heat, Sam's plants seemed to grow more vibrant with each passing day. The corn stalks now towered 12 feet high, their ears so heavy they bent the sturdy stalks like old men bowing in prayer. The first real test came in October, when the bank examiner arrived from the state capitol. Howard Pritchard was a thin man with steel-rimmed glasses, and the kind of pale complexion that spoke of a life spent indoors counting other people's failures. He'd come to verify the McCready property assessment, armed with forms and skepticism in equal measure. "I've heard the stories," Pritchard said, adjusting his glasses as he surveyed the impossible garden. "But banks deal in facts, not fairy tales." Sam watched as the examiner walked methodically through the rows, measuring and photographing, making notes in a leather-bound ledger. Martha brought out sweet tea and cornbread, her hospitality unwavering despite the man's obvious disdain for what he couldn't understand. "The soil samples don't lie," Pritchard continued, consulting his papers. "According to every geological survey, this land should be worth next to nothing. Drought damage, mineral depletion, structural debt, it's a textbook case for foreclosure." But as he spoke, something extraordinary happened. A group of children from the county school had arrived for their weekly field trip, part of a new program that brought kids to see the miracle garden. Their teacher, Miss Sarah Chen, had been documenting the plant's growth as part of a science project that had captured the attention of educators statewide. The children scattered through the garden like seeds themselves, their laughter mixing with the whisper of corn leaves in the breeze. 8-year-old Tommy Sanderson, whose family farm had been auctioned off the previous spring, ran his small hands along the tomato vines with reverence usually reserved for church. "My grandpa used to grow tomatoes," he told Sam, his voice small but serious. Before the ground got too tired to remember how, Pritchard watched the boy with something that might have been discomfort. "Children have active imaginations," he said dismissively. "They see what they want to see." That's when Lucy Martinez, the youngest visitor at barely 6 years old, did something that would be talked about in Millfield County for generations to come. She walked up to the most barren patch in the entire garden, a spot where even Sam's miraculous seeds had failed to take hold, and knelt down in the dusty soil. From her pocket she pulled a single sunflower seed, the kind given away free at the general store. Without ceremony or explanation, she pressed it into the hard earth and whispered something too quiet for the adults to hear. "Honey," Miss Chen called gently, "that ground's too hard for planting." But even as she spoke, the earth around Lucy's seed began to crack and soften. Green shoots pushed through the soil with visible urgency, and within minutes, not days or weeks, but actual minutes, a sunflower stood 3 feet tall, its face turned toward the afternoon sun like a child reaching for its mother's hand. Pritchard's ledger fell from his trembling finger. The man who had spent 30 years reducing miracles to numbers and hope to statistics, found himself face to face with something that couldn't be catalogued or dismissed. "This is impossible," he whispered, but his words carried wonder instead of doubt. Word of Lucy's sunflower spread faster than wildfire in August. By evening, the story had reached every household in 3 counties, growing with each telling until it had taken on the weight of legend. The little girl who had made flowers bloom with whispered prayers became the center of a pilgrimage that would reshape the entire region. They came by the hundreds now, not just the curious or the desperate, but families seeking something they couldn't name. The McDonald's family from Chicago, who had lost their patriarch to cancer and their faith along with him. The Riverside congregation from Memphis, traveling in buses to witness what their pastor called proof of grace in a faithless age. Veterans from the VA hospital in Springfield, some in wheelchairs, others carrying invisible wounds that no medicine could heal. Sam and Martha found themselves running an unofficial sanctuary. Their front porch became a gathering place, where strangers shared stories and coffee, where hope was distributed as freely as Martha's homemade biscuits. The old farmhouse, which had echoed with loneliness just months before, now rang with conversation in a dozen different languages. Margaret Ashworth arrived from the University of Chicago in November, leading a team of botanists, soil scientists, and agricultural experts. Unlike the previous investigators, she approached the phenomenon with something approaching reverence. "I've spent my career studying plant biology," she told Sam as they walked through the garden at dawn. "I've seen adaptations that boggle the mind, watched species evolve in real time, witnessed nature's most impossible transformations, but this," she gestured at the rows of impossible abundance, "this challenges everything I thought I knew about the relationship between hope and soil." Her team spent 3 weeks documenting every aspect of the garden. They measured growth rates that defied botanical law, analyzed fruit that contained nutrients in combinations that shouldn't exist, and recorded soil composition that changed daily without any apparent external influence. "The remarkable thing isn't just the growth," Ashworth explained to a gathering of local farmers. "It's the way the plants seem to communicate with each other, sharing resources and information in patterns we've never observed. They're not just surviving, they're thriving in community." Her words carried deeper meaning for the people of Millfield County, who had spent 3 years in isolation, each family struggling alone against forces too large to face individually. The garden had become more than a miracle, it was a lesson in survival through connection. The economic impact was undeniable. The Millfield Motor Lodge, which had been ready to close its doors permanently, now had a 6-month waiting list. Agnes Wheeler opened a small cafe specializing in produce from the Miracle Garden, and her hope pie became famous across the state. The local newspaper, the Millfield Gazette, which had been down to a single weekly edition, expanded to daily publication to cover the ongoing story, but it was the small changes that mattered most to Sam. He watched Mary Patterson, whose husband had left her with 3 children and a mountain of debt, find work as a tour guide at the garden. Her youngest daughter, who hadn't spoken since her father's abandonment, began talking again after spending afternoons helping Sam tend the tomato. He saw Jimmy Rodriguez, a veteran who had been living rough since returning from overseas, accept an offer to help maintain the visitor facilities. The man who had forgotten how to trust, found peace in the simple routine of preparing the soil for other people's hope. Even Richard Jameson changed. The man who had circled the struggling farms like a predator, now quietly canceled debts and extended payment terms, claiming it was simply good business. But Sam had seen him kneeling among the bean rows at sunset, his lips moving in what looked suspiciously like prayer. Winter brought new challenges and new miracles. While the rest of the county lay brown and dormant, the garden continued its impossible abundance. Snow fell everywhere, except within the garden's boundaries, where the temperature remained a perfect 70 degrees, and the plants continued their eternal growing season. Scientists offered theories about geothermal activity and microclimate anomalies, but the locals had simpler explanations. "Some places are just touched by grace," old Pete Williamson would say, and fewer people argued with him as time went on. Christmas Eve brought the largest gathering yet. Families from across the Midwest converged on the McCready farm, creating an impromptu celebration that spilled from the garden into the surrounding fields. Children played among the impossible cornstalks, while adults shared stories of their own buried hopes taking root. Pastor Williams held midnight service in the garden itself, his voice carrying across rows of plenty to people who had forgotten how to believe in abundance. As he spoke of seeds falling on fertile ground, Lucy Martinez stepped forward with another handful of sunflower seeds. "These are for everyone," she announced in her clear child's voice, "for when you go home and remember that hope grows anywhere you plant it." Each person took a seed, holding it like a promise. Some planted theirs immediately in the sacred soil of the Miracle Garden. Others tucked them away carefully, carrying pieces of impossibility back to their own barren places. The garden had taught them all a fundamental truth:
Miracles weren't reserved for the faithful or the deserving. They bloomed wherever people stopped believing in scarcity long enough to plant abundance. As the new year dawned, Sam stood once again beneath the old oak tree, Martha's hand warm in his. The miracle garden stretched before them, unchanged by season or skepticism, a testament to the truth that hope, once properly planted, could weather any storm. In Millfield County they don't call it the miracle garden anymore, they simply call it hope, and that's miracle enough for anyone willing to believe that some things are too important to explain away. The seeds Lucy Martinez handed out that Christmas Eve have been planted in 47 states and 12 countries, and while not all of them produce miraculous gardens, every single one has grown into something beautiful, because sometimes that's how hope works, one seed, one whispered prayer, one moment of faith at a time.